We are expanding Trans Mountain. Everyone agrees with dredging. Everyone agrees with expanding our ability to export more to Trans Mountain. That's going to buy us a couple extra, probably 200,000 or 300,000 barrels in the next 3 years. That probably gives you a year or two of growth. Okay. The other thing that we're expecting is Enbridge is going to expand their main line to the United States. They'll probably do a final investment decision on one expansion, within the next quarter or two, and then in a year on another expansion. That will give us another 250,000 barrels of egress. Again, that gives us another year or two. So we probably have until 2030 until we're tight. And God knows it takes 5 years to build a pipeline in this country. So we do have to start acting today. But the Alberta government is acting today, actually, on Northern Gateway. And they are starting to do that front end work. And people might complain that it's a province doing it. We've been left no choice with the oil tanker ban. It's not a mystery why no private proponent is advocating for that. It's because there's an oil tanker ban and because it's basically illegal, to offload oil at the end of the Pacific Northwest port. And EB has made it clear that there will be a legal fight.
This will come as no surprise to people who've been listening to Money Talks over the years, and I thank them for doing that. There's literally millions of hits. Well, Heather Exner-Pirot is the kind of analyst that I adore. Not only is she knowledgeable, but fact-based, research-based, lets us know, does all the work for us. Heather, thank you for finding time again with us.
Yeah, delighted to be here.
And I'll just remind people, by the way, you're with Macdonald Laurier Institute. You're sort of in charge of looking all of the stuff that is so topical these days. If I wanted to talk critical minerals, which we will, if I wanted to talk oil, which we will, want to talk pipelines, that's all the stuff you handle for them. Also, of course, you do it as an advisor to the Business Council of Canada. So you are busy. I appreciate the time. Let me start with the budget. And again, don't be shy about saying I'm crazy. This is a budget that I felt didn't match the rhetoric that we had been hearing. We were told it was an existential threat. We were told it was, an emergency situation, that time was of the essence, all of those kinds of things. Now, I appreciate that, when you're comparing to Justin Trudeau's budgets, that's a pretty low bar. So the fact that they even knew there was something called productivity beats what was happening before. So I appreciate that. And I'm glad they did. They stayed away from these stupid little boutique tax cuts. If my kid takes a piano lesson while wearing hockey equipment, I get a tax break. So I'm glad that, but I've got to ask you, did they make enough progress here to match what you see in the world, not just their rhetoric, but what you see happening?
Yeah. So the general consensus is no, and that's the consensus from the business community. And as you've pointed out, they are the ones that set very high expectations. They are the ones that said it'd be generational. They are the ones that said it'd be transformative. It isn't. But and I'll let others speak to the macroeconomic context, which there's obviously much more work to be done. But there were a few things in there, right? There were Easter eggs that I found on the energy and environment side, the climate side. While not, finally not being decisive, absolutely nothing decisive, but that give me some hope and give me some optimism that I think maybe lots of other people in the space aren't having. Because for us in this space, it's the Grey Cup Summit with Danielle Smith. That is kind of that, that end goal, that milestone that we're waiting for. And what I saw in Budget 2025 tees up, at least allows for a very constructive conversation on that, which I'm happy to talk more about.
Well, can I ask you just one thing quickly? They talked about getting rid of the emissions cap. That was a bit of a headline item. I didn't even think we had one yet. So seriously, when I read that, I went, I might be wrong, but I said, I don't even think we've got one in place at this point. We have a lot of talk about it, but we don't actually have one in place. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so it's been proposed since December 2024. Then all the things happened, so it hasn't moved forward. That was obviously under Trudeau and Guilbeault that was proposed. And the sector hated it and hates it because even though it wasn't finalized, it still had the effect of discouraging investment because it created uncertainty. You don't know what's going to happen. And particularly, oil is low right now, $60. No one's spending a ton on oil right now. But on LNG, those are live discussions. We're going out and asking foreign investors for tens of billions of dollars. And the question will be in Asia, what does the emissions cap mean for my investment? And there's literally no answer to that question.
Mhm.
So what did so this climate competitive strategy came out? Not much of a strategy, more of an indication of where they might go with a strategy. But it does say the important thing that if you do ABC, if you reduce emissions in another way, then we don't need the emissions cap. Now, lots of people cried foul and say, this isn't decisive. But for me, I feel like whether they intended to or not, they killed it politically. They've told
Mhm.
everybody that an emissions cap is not necessary, and we all hated it. And they've indicated, I would say, to the markets and to LNG buyers, that this is very likely to go away. The uphill climb they would have to do to actually come back and state the proposed regulations that were never in place in the first place. I think it's they have almost no room politically to do so. So I'm happy to take the victory lap of what was done because they've painted themselves into a corner. And I don't think they're stupid people. So I don't think they painted themselves into that corner without knowing, that they're actually not going to do an emissions cap. And most importantly, Mike, I don't think that the market is pricing in an emissions cap anymore. And that's the bottom line.
Yeah, I loved a couple of things there, by the way. Someone asked me the other day where I was getting interviewed, a couple of things that I think are really missing. And I think the public doesn't understand two things. The competition on for capital. It's not this sort of
Mm-hmm.
domestic little chat. We're in competition with the US, which, for example, has lowered the regulatory costs. They've reinstated, the tax reduction. So we're at a disadvantage. But the other one is what you've alluded to here. People don't realize that when we put in the capital gains exemption
Mm-hmm.
change, the increase in capital gains, it's that discourage. Didn't matter, it didn't go through. It already discourages capital investment, which we've seen reflected in the numbers. So I'm wondering, and I love your point about this, is that may create a little more certainty by saying we're not going to do this, but these conditions have to be met. It wasn't that strong a statement, but better. But what about the industrial carbon emissions when they do say we won't need to do this because of this list of other things? This is there a lot more uncertainty to clear up what those other things are?
Yes. So there's more uncertainty, but like I say, if you look at November 16th as, a date where either we'll have, of course they're not going to give away everything. It is politics. They're not going to say
Yeah.
everything they're going to debate with Danielle Smith 2 weeks before, but it's coming pretty quick. Now, if I do read between the lines and if I do give them the benefit of the doubt on all the things that mattered to me and to Alberta and to the oil and gas sector, I would argue where the CEOs write their letter, where Danielle Smith writes her letter, the industrial carbon price, the clean electricity regulations, the impact assessment act, the emissions cap, and the greenwashing bill. There is
Yes.
more information. And on those things, the carbon price and the impact assessment act and the clean electricity regs, they say that they are going to work in collaboration with the provinces. I know who the provinces are,
Yeah.
and I know
Right.
what you would have to do to get collaboration with them. And if Alberta and Saskatchewan come out of this in a month satisfied, I think I will be very likely to be satisfied. So they did put in language that to me indicates we're ready to play ball. We are movable on these things. Nothing is set in stone. We're going to work with you on those things. There's a lot of people that don't want to give them the benefit of the doubt anymore. And I understand that. My husband's one of those guys, that
Yeah.
just will never trust. We're done trusting these guys 5 years ago. But I'm willing to hang on for 3 more weeks.
Well, I'm hoping, I mean, but I don't see again, for all the rhetoric that we've had about the urgency and the fact, how do you not use oil and gas, one of, I mean, arguably our greatest resource, and take full
Mm-hmm.
advantage? And we're the only country that isn't taking full advantage. I know the UK tries to ruin their oil and gas opportunities, but I still think we got them beat. But one of the things I asked you last time we had a chance to chat was, did you think there'd be a pipeline, going to the West
Mm,
Coast? And you said yes, by the way. I want to make sure people heard you. You said yes, over 10 years, ask me. You weren't saying it was happening tomorrow morning. Do you think I mean, I'm listening to David Eby. He's the BC NDP
mm.
premier, with some of the First Nations saying, over my dead body, we're going to do this. Which, by the way, as you well appreciate, what a farce that is, given we've got about 200, 250 oil-filled tankers going down the BC coast over
Yeah.
every year, from Valdez, to the refineries down in Alaska, to the refineries down the coast. But still, do you feel the same way? I still haven't seen enough to make me think that they will do a pipeline to fully take advantage of the oil and gas advantage Canada has.
Yeah. So I'm going to make 2 points here, Mike. The first
Yeah.
is Why do I care about oil and gas and natural resources, and why do we compare about competitiveness? Because I feel like we may never be as competitive as the United States on tax, on regulatory,
Mm-hmm.
on those things. But our resources themselves are extremely competitive. We have extremely competitive deposits. And that's why that is the lowest hanging fruit for Canada. That's why when our economic crisis, what is the first thing you look at? Oil, gas, potash, gold, metallurgical coal, because those are the things that compete even
Yeah.
with a burdensome policy environment. So that's why, I think they become the focus of the conversation. With regards to a pipeline, I want to lay out what the situation is, absolutely we're having this existential question of Northern Gateway or Keystone XL. And looks like Keystone XL is in play with the United States. We'll see how that goes. I think they need it because shale is peaking, yada, yada. We all know, see that coming down the pipe. Hopefully, we get our act together before Venezuela does. And we have several more years ahead of a head start to get our act
Mm-hmm.
over than Venezuela for a Keystone. On the Northern Gateway side, David Eby is absolutely poisoning the well. He's going absolute, scorched earth on this. I can't understand it. I think it's horrifying, but that's what's happening. But this is where but what I want to say, what is happening in actual fact in the sector in Calgary? We are expanding Trans Mountain. Everyone agrees with dredging. Everyone agrees with expanding our ability to export more to Trans Mountain. That's going to buy us a couple extra, probably 200,000 or 300,000 barrels in the next 3 years. That probably gives you a year or two of growth. Okay. The other thing that we're expecting is Enbridge is going to expand their main line to the United States. They'll probably do a final investment decision on one expansion, within the next quarter or two, and then in a year on another expansion. That will give us another 250,000 barrels of egress. Again, that gives us another year or two.
Mm-hmm.
So we probably have until 2030 until we're tight. And God knows it takes 5 years to build a pipeline in this
Yeah.
country. So we do have to start acting today. But the Alberta government is acting today, actually, on Northern Gateway, and they are starting to do that front end work. And people might complain that it's a province doing it. We've been left no choice with the oil tanker ban. It's not a mystery why no private proponent is advocating for that. It's because there's an oil tanker ban, and because it's basically illegal. To offload oil at the end of the Pacific Northwest port, and EB has made it clear that there will be a legal fight over it. And so, but which is to say that I think the pipeline discussion might be a 2026 discussion. In the meantime, we can get rid of the emissions cap. We can reform the Impact Assessment Act. We can do a few things to fill that other 500,000 barrels that I feel pretty clearly is going to be coming online in the next few years.
Back to Keystone just for a second. I mean, I think, we've got a much more welcoming administration in the Trump administration. But again, that does nothing for diversifying our customers. I mean, that whole
Yeah.
discussion in February and March came, we've got to diversify away from the US. I just remind people, I think that's also got a lot more green light ability, if we're just going, because the Alberta pipeline part is already built or,
Yeah.
largely built. You can just go down in the States and they may be more welcoming. We'll see. But the other side I want to talk to you about is critical minerals. I mean, you look at all of the resources. You mentioned that earlier, that it's one of our great advantages. So here's a real quick question. How long does it take, on average? What would we expect? Because we're talking about these things like it's going to solve our unemployment problem tomorrow morning. And I really think the timeframes haven't been matched up. We're talking long-term projects. And again, stuff I read says you'd be lucky in 10 to 15 years. Let's start. They're talking a lot in Alberta. They're running, Ontario. They're running ads about the Ring of Fire as if that's going to, and they have serious problems with their unemployment, et cetera. That ain't going to solve them, even if everything went well, let alone they have Indigenous First Nations opponents there. But how long does it take to get this, give us a timeline to have it meaningful there?
Yeah, I mean, so absolutely true. And in fact, by some standards, it takes even longer than that in Canada. There's, you can
Mm-hmm.
look at some numbers from discovery to production, where it's in the 20 years plus. Some of that is market related, though, I have to say. Not all of that is permitting.
Yes.
Some of that is market related, and people have to appreciate it. But is Canada longer than almost every other country? Yes. Does that mean capital would usually rather go to a different country? Yes, it is. And to your point, that's what we're competing with: a return on your investment in a reasonable amount of time. And Canada doesn't seem to promise that. Now, are we hooped though? And this is, there are some intermediate solutions. And that is that we have been mining for a long time, and there are a lot of projects that can be expanded, and there's a lot of projects that are, brownfield, and there's things that used to be running and are longer running, and we could bring them back up. And I do have to say, there's so many dynamics. We absolutely need to improve the permitting system. I've seen some real advances made in the last 8 to 10 months by a lot of the provinces, in Nova Scotia, in Ontario, in BC, even on some fronts, have made real advances. Saskatchewan never had to do anything. They're already great in the territories, and some of the feds. And again, what their approach is, they are working behind the scenes, whether, show me, eventually we need to see, that we're getting more investment, but there is at least political pressure to do these things faster. But there are some healthy sectors, and I don't think we should, not remember that potash is attracting, the biggest BHP, biggest, mining company in the world's biggest investment ever right now. Potash is moving ahead. Never needed a federal assessment, by the way. That was a Saskatchewan only assessment back in 2012. They've been waiting for the market. A couple $1 billion getting put in there, and more billions when the market calls for it. And gold. I think the last 6 mines that have been opened in Canada have been for gold. And again, why is that? Because the market is absolutely burning hot. And everyone that could get a gold mine online sooner or had a project in the wings that they could start up is now able to do that. And so there are a handful of bright spots. And again, with regards to the Ring of Fire, that to me is a bit of a red herring, to your point. By the government of Ontario's estimates alone, in the Blue Jays ad, it said, I think 20 billion or 22 billion. Fine print over 30 years is the fine print if you actually go to the website that they point out. So important regional economic development for sure. Don't want to diminish the importance of that, to people in Northern Ontario. Is that something that will move the dial on Ontario's economy or Canada's economy? I don't think so, especially when you have something like Sudbury, which is actually a superior mining jurisdiction that is very much in kind of neutral mode and could absolutely be ramped up if commodity prices called for it.
I'm glad you mentioned potash. A lot of, obviously, the reasons are obvious. The tariff dispute with the states, and do they need Canada? Do they not need Canada? And we did talk about oil. We did talk about, some of our gas exports, electricity, et cetera. Man, they need our potash. Their farmers are probably as desperate for our potash exports as any other commodity that we're talking about. Doesn't get the headlines, but I just felt that I've been a critic, by the way, from day one, not Johnny come lately to it or hindsight, of how we tried to negotiate with the Americans. I said, if you thought that Donald Trump cared about the impact on Canada on February 5th, you were wrong. Talk about the impact on America. Talk about the benefits to America. And I thought potash should be way up there. And it's starting to get some play with the farmers in the U.S. But I thought that was, and I loved your list there. There's a lot of things that I think we should have been pushing forward in a positive way. Like, we're economic partners. We supply you with this. Remains to be seen what they've done down there.
Yeah.
That's another subject, but still.
Well, let me talk about potash and I'll put uranium in the category.
Yes.
And I wrote a recent piece. So, we're all obsessed with critical minerals. Actually, some good news in the budget. For me, it looked like the Mining Association Canada wrote it. So the mining industry is pretty happy this week, and also with the G7 Critical Minerals Alliance announcement. Some real money has been put in that should be helpful to juniors. But and I've said it, and now people are saying it, you can't just stick half the periodic table, on a list and expect policy to just flow out of it.
Yes.
What you need to do for gold versus potash versus rare earth elements these are completely different markets, completely different policy approaches. And so I've been, making the case that, there's 4 categories that we need different policy approaches are. One is those things like rare earth, antimony, gallium, germanium, that don't have a big market. There will never be an economic case for a company to come in and do it and compete with China, but we need it for our supply chains. So we need something to do there. But speaking of uranium, potash, the category I put those 2 alone in is one where Canada actually has market dominance, where we can actually set the price. In potash, we are the world's #1 producer. In uranium, we are the world's #2 producer. And that with those things, not to manipulate like China or Russia would manipulate, but to use it as leverage to develop alliances. And
Hmm.
those two things are actually so strategic where you can say, you know what? You will always have energy and food security,
Yeah.
two pretty important things, if you're friends with Canada. You will always have fertilizer and you will always have uranium for nuclear power plants. And we can get it to you, and we are not going to run out. For as long as anyone on this planet is alive today, we'll be alive. And we could have done more. And here's the other thing is that the United States can put a bit more money into uranium or potash and some domestic development, and maybe have some redundancy or leave their pressures, or become more independent. They cannot compete. Again, the quality of the resource for those two
Yes.
particular commodities in Canada, you just can't compete with that. That's just how the geology was distributed around the world. And so if their farmers have to use potash that they produce in the United States alone, I don't think they could produce enough, but it would be more expensive. That means that
Yeah.
they'd just be paying more for their input costs for fertilizer. And therefore, farming is extremely trade exposed. You're just less competitive globally. And this is the trick for the United States. I know they want more independence on some critical minerals, but some things, if they just increase the price of all of their inputs by making them be domestic, they will just stop being competitive globally.
Yeah.
And so this is an area where I think Canada says, we need buyers. Actually, we can't use up all this potash. We can't scale if this is for domestic purpose. We need buyers. We'll give you a great price. There's absolutely no security concerns. It's not going on a ship that can be stopped by China or by Russia or anyone. And these are areas where we can be forging those long-term ties. Guess what? Cameco and Brookfield were able to
Yes.
do that with the Westinghouse deal, and really tie the United States to, I would say 80 years of uranium supply with northern Saskatchewan.
Well, my thing is that it would be news to many Canadians. Can you imagine what news that is to Americans? And again, I'm
Mhm.
not putting people understand. I'm not putting words in Heather's mouth here. These are my words. I think they argued the wrong stuff from day one. Reciprocal tariffs? Are you crazy? Make Canadians pay more? And Donald Trump's can say, "Well, I'm going to change my mind. They're making Canadians pay more." But that's exactly the kind of thing that we should. And I'm glad. I want Canadians to know. Feel optimistic about that. We've got
Yeah.
these quality resources, as you say, not just the amount, but the quality of them. That's a great
Hmm.
note to finish on, because that's very positive. And I'm going to I can hardly wait to hear what you've got to say after the so-called Grey Cup Summit and all the premiers
Yes.
get together. Let's hope they're more successful than they were about removing trade barriers, but
Yeah,
we'll see.
yeah. Yes, I hope so. Some decisive action is required at this point, and I think people will be pretty impatient if we're still having these
Yeah.
discussions in 2026.
Well, speaking of 2026, I got to tell you, I am thrilled that you're coming to the World Outlook Conference. I think you're going to
Yes,
enjoy it, first of all, but I know the audience will enjoy you just as they have today. But Heather, so I look forward to seeing you then.
great. I look forward to it too. Thanks so much, Mike.